Boy, everybody got quiet. A guy in a tie came up to the front. Good evening, everybody, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Trinity University. No rain tonight. We need the rain, but it's nice to see the sun this afternoon. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Distinguished Science Lecture presented by Dr. Gretchen Daily. My name is David Ribble, and I serve as the Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs. And as part of my work, I have the great pleasure to coordinate the Distinguished Scientist Lecture Series. This important series here on campus is made possible by a gift from Mr. and Mrs. Walter F. Brown of San Antonio. And these series explore the process of science, the building of scientific knowledge, and the impact of and application of scientific and technological advances. So please join me in thanking the Browns for enriching the Trinity community by sponsoring tonight's event. After the lecture, Dr. Daly will answer a few questions from the audience, but before the Q&A, we'll take a brief pause so that members of the audience who have other commitments this evening can exit without disturbing them that conversation during the Q&A. And in case you haven't already done so, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices. And please realize that any recording of or photographing in Laurie Auditorium is not allowed. So we have a wonderful special speaker tonight, but this is also a special night because this is made possible due to a collaboration between Academic Affairs and the Trinity University Press. And here to welcome you on behalf of the Trinity University Press is the director, Tom Payton.
Thank you, David. I'm Tom Payton, director of Trinity University Press. We are a mission-driven organization by way of our publications, community engagement, and programming in various areas of interest. We're especially interested in the relationships between humans and their physical worlds, the physical worlds they inhabit, from wilderness and nature to our built urban environments, all with a keen eye on a sense of locality and uniqueness of place. Our goal as an organization is to help educate and enlighten, discover and debate, and to contribute to conservation alongside creative change. There could be no better example of this intention and mission on behalf of Trinity University Press than for the new book whose publication we're celebrating this evening, One Tree, which is by Gretchen Daily, our speaker this evening, and photographer and San Antonio native Chuck Katz, who's with us this evening also. Copies of this book, along with the previous book that we've published with this duo, The Power of Trees, will be available in the lobby after the event, and I'm sure they both will be happy to sign books for you. There will be a Q&A session afterwards. Gretchen will lead that, but if you have a question, please just step up to one of the microphones on either side here so that everyone can hear what you have to share. Thank you to Academic Affairs, especially Dee Jones and David Ribble, for partnering with us to bring Gretchen to campus for a couple of days. It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce Trinity Senior, and I understand I just learned fourth generation Trinity student, Molly Linehan, who will introduce our speaker. Ms. Linehan majors in biology and Spanish and has exemplified her career at Trinity as a first-year experienced peer tutor, STEM peer tutor, board member for the Friends of San Antonio Natural Areas, and as a longtime research assistant for Professor Kelly Lyons. Please welcome Molly Linehan.
Thank you so much. My name is Molly Linehan, again, and I'm a biology and Spanish major here at Trinity University. I have the honor tonight of introducing our distinguished scientist, Dr. Gretchen Daily. When I first started researching Dr. Daily to write this introduction, it felt like I was reading the character biography of a fictional science expert in a movie who's done more things than seem possible in a single person's lifetime. Dr. Daily received her BS, MS, and PhD in the biological sciences from Stanford University, where today she serves as the director of the Center for Conservation Biology, the Bing Professor of Environmental Science, and a member of the Woods Institute for the Environment. Outside of Stanford, she is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and is a board member of the Nature Conservancy and the Stockholm Resilience Center. She's a co-founder of the Natural Capital Project, a partnership among Stanford, the Chinese Academy of Science, the University of Minnesota, the Nature Conservancy, and the World Wildlife Fund. The Natural Capital Project aims to integrate scientific evidence with legislative, financial, and land use decisions across the world. Dr. Daily readily acknowledges something that I think is often difficult for scientists to say out loud, that science is not everything. We cannot fix the world with science alone. We need politicians and writers, philosophers and engineers, laborers and lawyers and landowners, and everyone else to work together to improve our future. As a millennial who has been handed this future, I appreciate this perspective as the only way, if you'll forgive my fatalism, to save the planet as we know it. One of the headline statements from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent reports states, "Climate-related risks to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth are projected to increase with global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and increase further with 2 degrees Celsius." In that same report, the IPCC says that we will likely reach that 1.5 degrees of warming between the years of 2030 and 2052 if we don't change something. Dr. Daily is doing the work right now to make people realize that that change is not only necessary, but achievable. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Daily to ourselves for this hour. And please join me in thanking her again for being with us here tonight.
Can everybody hear okay? Let's see. Can you guys hear? How's this? It's really rustling around here. Wait a minute. Maybe I'll put it over. I'm sorry, how's that? Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay, here we go. Great, thank you. Thanks for that incredible San Antonio welcome. I got here this afternoon, and it's been the warmest welcome I could possibly ever hope for. So a huge thanks to everybody who's playing a part in making my visit so interesting and fun and warm. And yeah, playing off of that really nice introduction, I have to say, well, it's my first time here. There's so much going on, and I can't wait to learn about it in all the realms that Molly referenced, you know, way beyond science and actually reaching people and opening up a brighter future for all of us, and especially the younger people among us. And yeah, in my own life, I got turned on to science back in high school and junior high. My dad was in the US military, and we got stationed over in West Germany where there was acid rain. You don't hear that much about it these days, but it was incredible to be a young teenager and you know, be told that, well, acid was coming out of the sky, and that's why all the buildings were kind of melting away, all those beautiful little sculptures in the old medieval architecture and stuff, and why the forests were just dying off in vast stretches and lakes and things. So it's kind of nice actually to reflect on how much we did do to improve the acid rain situation. But back then I thought becoming a scientist was definitely the answer. And I've been humbled every step of the way since that day, seeing how it is just a tiny piece of the picture. And that brings me to our dangerous situation tonight. It's dangerous in a couple of ways. One is, you know, I've been working with this wonderful San Antonian guy named Chuck Katz in trying to reach more people through the power of, you know, art writ large, you know, to convey maybe the complexity and the ambiguity in our situation in the world, and do so in more aesthetic and emotional ways, and really to bring a message of hope. But I hear that he has his entire fan club assembled tonight, family and friends going back to, you know, kindergarten and stuff. So there's a lot of pressure on me up here. If you're not part of that fan club, you can sympathize for me. But anyway, it's fantastic to have such a tremendous group here, and I want to say how grateful I am actually to Trinity University Press, especially in bringing the little reflections that we've done together about the connections between people and nature, just how interdependent we are, to the fore in a very different way for me. And this brings me actually then to the second danger for tonight. It's incredible how, in the past, you could say, people depended on nature. We all know that. We depend intimately on nature for almost every aspect of our lives. But nature didn't depend on us. That's not true anymore. The fate of all known life in the universe depends on us more than on any other force. And that leaves a big responsibility on our shoulders too, beyond Chuck's fan club. So with those two huge responsibilities, what I want to do is just dive into some neat stories and let them kind of unfold with some pictures and hopefully some fun along the way that are opening up a really new way, not only of thinking about harmonizing people and nature, but actually seeing it happen. And this is against a backdrop, in Costa Rica, where we did the most recent book called One Tree. Here's a shot of the cover. Costa Rica was the poster child of planetary destruction. When I first started working there in the early 90s, they had the highest deforestation rate on the planet, and they, ever recorded, and just kind of emblemized mass extinction, given how much of the world's, richness of life is concentrated in the tropics. And you look at what's going on today, we're likely to drive about half of the world's different species, the plants and animals and things, to extinction in this 100-year shot of time. It's unbelievable to kind of let that sink in a little bit. But wherever you're from, here in Texas, experiencing the flooding, ever more dramatic, or, I've just come from California that's in an extended drought, and we have these horrific fires that I'm sure you've read about and hopefully, not experienced too closely. But wherever you look, there's a level of crisis unfolding that's brand new, and how can we handle that? And how can we, I have two teenagers, how can we open up a bright future for our kids, our grandkids, and everybody to come? And I feel on the one hand, sometimes demoralized enough that I stop looking at the paper for a week. I'll give myself a break, that kind of thing. But overall, I feel there's a tremendous awakening underway, and that's what I'd like to get into tonight. And I feel that, one very simple and very broad-brushed way of framing it is that you could say that in the 19th century, many people held the view that the only way to run a successful economic system was with slavery. And you could say, looking back in the 20th century, that many, many people held the view that, similarly, maybe however unfortunate, the only way to run an economic system was with environmental devastation. And I'm hopeful that this awakening, and there's signs of it all over the world that's happening today, is much more about reaching for harmonizing people among themselves and also people and nature. And reaching for a totally different and really inspiring vision of, say, an ecological civilization with inclusive, green growth. So how do we define that? How do we realize it? And what are the signs? That's what I'll try to convey in a few stories. And then I really look forward to talking and meeting more of you over the next days and learning a lot more about what's going on around here. So going back to Costa Rica, I've been working there for a long time. And this is what you see in many places. How many have been to Costa Rica? I know many in the room. Okay, fantastic. Well, this is looking over at the Talamanca mountain range from the Pacific down in the south, very near the Panamanian border. And you see a lot of pasture and you see a lot of coffee. Those are two of the main livelihoods in the region. And when I got going there's an old picture of me together with kids, and I was working out on farms and ranches all over, just trying to see, what was the likely future of life, given that it hinged on how we do our farming and ranching more than anything, really, apart from, whether we have a nuclear holocaust or something. But so we're out on farms, and I'm getting permission from everybody to, work on their land. People are incredibly friendly there, as I'm sure everybody's experienced. And hiring the kids, we're out, in this case, sampling butterflies. So they fly into these little traps, and we put numbers on them. You can probably see here this girl, Jessica, she's just learning how to write. It's fine to write on a butterfly's wing. It's sort of like painting your fingernail. And keeping track of the variety of life. And that butterfly looks like a dead leaf, but when it opens up, it's actually a dazzling blue-green color. But then I found out that the kids were all eating the bait that we were using to attract the butterflies. You make up these big buckets full of bananas, and you let them rot for a couple days, and you add in there's a secret recipe that I can't reveal completely, but you add in a bit of molasses and rum. Everybody argues over the right proportion, but and that just attracts butterflies from far and wide. And you can really, it's like taking kind of a blood sample of the landscape. You get a sense of what all can live there, and each butterfly needs its own plant, so it really tells you a lot about the plant community and then everything else. But realizing more and more as I got to know everybody, how tough life was, and the trade-offs maybe between economic development and protecting the environment. My mind got going a lot on that. And around that time, it was stunning to see Costa Rica around 1997, thanks to some really visionary leaders. One guy who had his PhD in hydrology, really at the helm, Alvaro Umaña. He actually wrote the foreword to the book One Tree. He was pioneer in so many ways, but one was in laying out the very first payment for ecosystem service, payment for the benefits of nature system at a countrywide scale. And in Costa Rica, they started paying people back in the 90s. Anybody could sign up. It was a voluntary scheme. Looks like you got nothing, but the program was vastly oversubscribed. Little bits of land that are really steep and unsuited to most cows or coffee or other, human types of uses would actually get a real payment to conserve or restore forest. And these payment streams came in to secure the different benefits up there, climate, the water purification for hydropower. He was a PhD hydrologist, and they ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize, he and the president, for bringing this harmony to people and nature, as well as to people broadly in Central America at that time. So it was amazing to see that happen, and many countries have been inspired by the Costa Rican model. And going from there, what I'd like to do is broaden now and just give you a quick sweep through some of the history, and then where we are today, taking off, it's 20 years since these initial innovations. Where are we, and can we really be hopeful about this vision of inclusive green growth or development? So just a thumbnail sketch, going back to the early 90s, a lot of people in economics, really woke up to the devastation that was going on. And here's one of my favorite people who passed away just a year and a half ago, Ken Arrow, in the late 90s. He was a Nobel laureate in economics. 5 of his students won the Nobel Prize in economics, a huge influence in that field. And he in the latter part of his life, devoted himself mostly to, all along it was to social causes and more to environment and sustainability related causes. And he brought in a lot of other economists with a lot of street cred to help reshape the thinking and start thinking about nature in a way that confronts, the main drivers of change that operate through our economic system, many of them. So that was really pivotal, having him and all these other leaders come together and start laying out a new model. And then with places like Costa Rica showing, whether they'd ever heard of Ken Arrow or not, showing how things could be done differently, that also really activated kind of these points of light and innovation around the world. Another case was in New York City, which you can see here on the, how many of you guys know the New York City sort of watershed case? So yeah, just a few hands. It's a really famous one around the planet now, partly because it was New York, of course. Anything you do in Texas, too, will get known planet-wide. But anyway, there's the city. There's 9 or 10 million people living and working in the city. They get their water from this place, this beautiful Catskills, Delaware watershed area up to the north, about 100 miles away. And the water started, there'd be flood events. There was a big worry about cryptosporidium and giardia that were appearing in water when there were heavy rains, like you're experiencing now in Austin and more widely. And the, officials of the city said, okay, in the EPA, you really have to do something to secure your supply. It was unfiltered. This comes basically right out of that mountainous area. And people looked into it and thought, okay, well, we could build a big old filtration plant, and they'd done that for one watershed where they get about 10% of the supply. And that cost a fortune, and that let them pencil it out pretty easily for the 90%. Would be $6 to $8 billion in upfront capital costs, with annual operating expenses of several $100 million a year. And that led people to rethink the equation and go out and talk to landholders, all the rural people living up there, like Dave Hawley, whom I got to meet running this dairy farm, and a lot of apple growers, a lot of foresters. And they realized that at a cost of maybe $1 to $1.5 billion, so way less than the $6 to $8 billion, they could get all these people on board, and indeed over 90% volunteered then for this program to change the way they manage land and do things like the city paid for this cool solar tent, basically to put the cows in rather than the beautiful but dank and dark barns that are not such healthy places for especially the calves, and really transform that whole system to look at it, as not only a beautiful place to be or a rural place that wasn't that developed compared to the city, but a place that could work in partnership with the city for 3 wins. So basically, the people down in the city, they're winning and getting clean water at the lowest cost. People up in the Catskills are finally getting paid for a service that they've always provided and that they're ever more needed for. And then what's the third win? If you care about anything else, you sort of say, would you rather spend a romantic weekend in the filtration plant of the other watershed or, up in the Catskills? There are all these other benefits that are captured under that scheme. So that's just another example that's helping to wake up people into the possibilities. And this example, I'll tell you soon, it's spread all over the planet now. And then the Natural Capital Project, and soon after Chuck Katz came along, this big partnership, again, going way beyond science, and there are these core partners that Molly mentioned, but about 250 partners total around the world, developing the ideas and trying to systematize a view and come up with a common way of talking about the values of nature, and understanding many different perspectives, and coming up with a language that can work for a lot of different cultures and contexts, and also for our policy and financial systems. And so natural capital, what is the value of it? We're talking about Earth's lands, waters, all the life forms. Obviously, you can't just boil all that down to a few dollars and cents here and there, but you can make a powerful argument looking at least at some dimensions of value that typically everybody agrees on. Being safe from floods, having safe drinking water, and all that sort of thing. So we can think about it at one level, it's almost infinite. It is infinite. We would not be here on planet Earth if it were not for the biosphere, just looking at the moon. We need life for everything, for the soils that I used to think of as ground up rock, but I spent one summer actually digging through soil with a microscope, and it made me stop that 5-second rule or whatever. There's so many little monsters down there. Once you look them in the eye, you're less sure if you want to eat them all. But and then, the atmosphere was really, here on Earth, was created by life. So we depend on the biosphere for nearly everything. And we know we're losing all these dimensions of nature very, very rapidly in our lifetimes. We know that scarcity and the way we have organized our economies, elevates value. But what are the values? How do you even go at that? So about, back in the 2000s, there was very little to go on in terms of valuing nature or a shared language. And what we started doing was just bit by bit convening groups of people all over, not just the Natural Capital Project by any means, but many people worrying about this and going out. And we've put together now, scrolling forward, at least a system for thinking about core sort of biophysical functions of the biosphere that we depend on for protecting us on coastlines. And the Gulf Coast has the highest return frequency of hurricanes, I think, in the world. That's what I've always heard. If anybody wants to scream that that's not right, here's your chance. But, there's so many benefits that we're now realizing we've taken for granted, like flood control or just food security, nutritional security, water, and then even things like mental health. So we've developed science in each of these and many other arenas, sort of 25 arenas now, and packaged it all up in a way that's much more accessible than it ever has been before to impact decisions. And I'll just show you a little bit about it. So any students, it's hard for older people, I have to confess, but young people like Molly and all her friends could easily master this software system called Invest, where we can relate changes across a landscape or a seascape to changes in our security in all these different dimensions in climate and with respect to flooding or food or energy and other things. And this software system has now been picked up and is used to some degree in most countries, and in some really spectacularly. And the way it works, I'm going to get into a little detour into the biodiversity side of it, the little unsung heroes do you guys know what you're looking at right now? It's a bush, I know. Biologists get really excited even by bushes. So that is a coffee plant. So if you had any coffee today, it came from a plant just like that, and the really, the white flowers here. Sorry, I skipped ahead. And now this thing isn't responding, but yeah, there we go. Those white flowers, they only open for a few days per year. And to have the harvest, and I'll show you how much the harvest depends on pollinators. You have to have bees flying around to some degree for about 2/3 of our different crops, most of the fruits, nuts, and veggies, all the healthy stuff, and then the drugs like coffee. And it's these amazing bees. I'm going to show you some from all over the world, because even in a tiny coffee farm, guess how many different types of bee you have? Does anybody want to make a guess? So in Costa Rica, I thought the hard work would be catching the bees. That was actually really easy. And we caught within a month about 700 different types in this one tiny farm. And it turned out the hard part was telling them all apart. You have to check whether their hairs, have split ends over the eyebrow, stuff like that. And I'm just going to show you a few so you get a sense of the beauty and the wonder, and just to kind of emphasize repeating kind of a theme that Molly brought up of the humility in all this. We're never going to know all the values of nature. And we're lucky if we get close to sensing the wonder and deep value in nature. But when you look closely, it's amazing what other worlds open up that otherwise, you don't even realize are there. So just looking at those 700 different bees, even though I was going blind at the microscope and breaking my back to sit there hours and hours a day, it was one of the best experiences of my life. And here's some photos by someone I haven't gotten Chuck to start photographing the bees. That's the next project. But here's some that are really beautifully done. Just have a look. Yeah, we're getting stuck on this one again. See, this is the deep mystery of nature. I don't know if somebody could help me past this Thyreus wallaceae from the Philippines. Maybe I'm too far. That's a good point. I'll have to stand closer. There we go. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I'll stay up here. Here's one from Guyana. Now, most of these bees are kind of cleaned off and made to look perfect for the photo. But here's how they often look. They're a mess. They're just loaded up with pollen. And flowers, like if you take a watermelon, guess how many pollen grains, individual little balls of yellow, you need to get a nice, juicy, ripe, sweet, watermelon. You need a minimum of 1,000 grains. And most bees can only, then I've gotten to the business of all this stuff, like most bees can only carry 25 grains at a shot, and yet the watermelon flower is only open for a day. And bees don't like to fly when it's boiling hot in the middle of the day in watermelon growing country, so there's just these two windows in the morning and evening when you really, if you're a farmer, you need a lot of bees out there, motoring around and delivering the pollen. So you can get really deeply into all this, and we did on a few cool topics. We also looked into, I'll get into them in a second, so the bees are all out there pollinating. I'm starting to think more and more about, what are the different things doing and how much can survive out in farmland, and there's a lot to answer that second question. Anybody know this bird? We're in Costa Rica again. It's the royal flycatcher, and that's the male. They go around eating insects like the bees. They get really feisty when you catch them. We always just check them out, put a little bracelet on their ankle, and then let them go. And there's the female. They get equally feisty and want to get back to eating breakfast. Here's a really cool one, the red-legged honey creeper, one of the, key to pollination as well, going around sipping nectar from a lot of different tropical trees. And then we find, we've looked at everything. Here's some bats. This is the biggest bat in the New World, and it's the biggest carnivorous bat in the whole world. It's called spectral's bat in English. And we found it, you can see that's a coffee shrub, right behind Jason there. And we've just, right by the car. And they go around eating those birds. So it's the whole cycle of life. And there are a lot of other mammals, non-flying ones too. This is a silky anteater that, I'm still not good at finding. I have friends who are so brilliant at finding things, and I think I walk past them. But they're real small. You could hold them in the palm of your hand, really. So anyway, over time, we've had tons of brilliant students working in these field sites in Costa Rica, trying to figure out, what proportion of species on the y-axis in these different groups running along the x-axis, like plants, non-flying mammals, bats, birds, reptiles, amphibians. What fraction can really live on farms? What fraction is going to come into the 21st century, with us and be here surviving human impacts? And you can see across the groups that there are a bunch that are restricted to forest in green, certainly among the plants. Many plants are never going to make it, the native plants outside of their forest habitat. But a lot of the animals can do pretty well out in the crop fields and pasture if there's forest nearby. And many of them, are kind of half the time in the forest and half in the open. And that gives us real hope and isn't something to brush aside as, oh, those are trash species or whatever that might be said by some crazy biologists. But this is our hope, is to bring these, they're all native to Costa Rica, bring them into this century to the end and on beyond with us. So with all that hope, how do we quantify the value and make it worthwhile for farmers to grow in a way that does sustain them? And so we looked, I'm just going to say quickly, for those three groups, bees, birds, and bats, we did a lot of different experiments that took quite a few years. And we found, for example, that bees boost coffee yield by 20%. If your coffee is near forest, so within ideally 100 meters of forest, and at the most, say, 500 meters away, you get a nice boost not only in yield but also in quality. And that means everything in terms of the economics of a farm, meaning you're making a profit as opposed to a loss in that industry, which is really on the margin. With birds, we found that the main infestation of pests on coffee are suppressed by 50%, thanks to a few of the birds. We only looked at a few where we actually took back little fecal samples that they'd give us, brought them to Stanford, and did all this DNA testing to see what they were eating and how many pests they were eating. And then we got really tangled up with the bats, and we haven't figured out the story on the bats, so I'm not going to speculate too much here, but they do a lot of good things for farmers, and they also eat a lot of the good insects and stuff, so it's hard to know what their net effects are, but I wouldn't wish them away. So there we go on the values, and I just say there have been thousands of studies over the past decade on these types of values now, and it's really cool to see, and that's what's going into the INVEST software. That just gives you a taste for how you would measure some of those values. But then there's this big question, well, how do you go from measuring those things on a small scale on a few farms to really changing policy and changing our financial system? Before diving into that, I want to take us to a totally different realm, and then we're going to dive into this question. And the different realm is cities. So more and more, humanity is becoming an urban species. We all know that over half of humanity is packed into cities today. It's well over that in the US. And worldwide, we're expected to have at least 70% of all people living in cities, often cities without a molecule of chlorophyll to be seen. And so another brilliant student really opened my eyes to this arena, Greg Bratman, who's now a professor up at University of Washington, asking, well, how does that affect people? And you can look out at just kind of these aggregate statistics and see that if you're living in a city, you have a 20% heightened risk of anxiety and related disorders, and a 40% increase in the risk of mood or kind of depression-related disorders. And all this has been written up more and more. You've probably seen, this was on the cover of The Economist a few years back, where you can scan people's brains and actually make a pretty accurate guess as to where they grew up between the ages 0 and 5, based on their stress response coming from the amygdala, which is part of the brain that really gets hardwired in when you're little. And then you can also guess pretty accurately where they live today based similarly on the stress response when they're in a brain scanner, in other parts of the brain that remain plastic and sort of ever changing through a person's life. So this got us interested. We don't know whether there's a causal set of mechanisms at play, but there's certainly some related trends of more and more people in cities, less and less time and access, to nature, less and less time for nature and access to it, more and more being hooked on our devices. Again, I have teenagers, and that's my biggest worry for them. And so Greg led these really neat studies, and I'll just show you an example of one of them, where we brought people in from the urban Bay Area, Silicon Valley, volunteers. They would come to the psychology building, which is right behind that bus, and they take some tests. There are tons of these psychology tests that have been played with for decades, and I'll show you a couple. Then they take that shuttle bus and either go walk on a busy street. It's not a horrible street like in the biggest mega cities of the world by any means. It's just a busy street with some traffic. Or they'd walk for 50 minutes in that more natural area on the campus, equidistant from the psychology building, and then they come back and take the tests again. Okay, so you're coming in, take tests. Everybody's kind of stressed when they arrive because there's no parking and, and they're living in Silicon Valley, what can I say? So they came in and here's what we found. Here's one type of test. So you gotta wake up now really, whatever you were drinking before you came, or if you ate too much pasta. Wake up, you got to do some math problems really quick. That's how the thing works. So you present these poor subjects with a math problem. They have to say true or false, and then they've got to remember the letter that will come between the little math questions. So true or false, letter. True or false, letter. Hope you're keeping up. True or false, letter. True or false, letter. And then you ask them, okay, what was the sequence of letters? I hope you guys got that. And you can go on forever. The test can get really torturous, actually. But here's the amazing finding that I thought this poor student, Greg, was going to be with me for the next 1,000 years, but he found stunning results in each thing. So this is called the O-span task, to make it sound sophisticated. And all you got to see is on the y-axis, you've got the difference in the number of letters remembered, sort of after minus before to make the nature people come out positive, okay? So after they walked for 50 minutes, they remember on average 10 more letters if you run these sequences at them. And you can go on and on, like I said, than before. Whereas the people who walked on the busy street had, at least we didn't make them worse off, but they had no change. So it's pretty amazing, and there's a lot of other work reporting similar findings. And then we looked at things like rumination. And if I ever speak about this in the UK, everybody thinks I'm talking about cows ruminating. But in America, that word rumination refers to kind of self-referential, negative thoughts, all the kicking you do of yourself. I do this a lot, I know, have, over kind of dumb things I did in the past, or little regrets I might have kind of repetitively. And this is what you look like when you're doing it. And so you want to get out of that. And that's, kind of if you get into too much rumination, that's a real risk factor for the onset of more full-blown depression. So we looked into it a lot, and this is just one little result to show you of many, where before and after the walk again, and you see the nature people, they just stop ruminating. They get out. I'd love to hear more theories on why, and we want to be testing more and more what the causal mechanisms might be and what kinds of interventions would be helpful. But, the urban walkers had no change, at least, no significant reduction. So I feel good about that, at least. But the nature people, just 50 minutes out there, and your thoughts are lifted away from, that little cycle that's so easy to get into. So here we're asking people, I spend a great deal of time thinking back over my embarrassing or disappointing moments. So you can kind of dig in along those lines, and you consistently get this finding. And then we went to a underground facility where you can actually scan people's brains to dig into this a little more on the rumination. And we found, in fact, to make the story short, that people who walked in nature, the blood flow to the part of the brain where rumination is typically lighting up. It's not all that well understood, but the blood flow actually goes down in the nature walkers as compared to the urban walkers. And this was really expensive to run, so we made everybody walk for an hour and a half to make sure we got some kind of result. And again, we were surprised at how stark the difference is. So just to say, I'm giving you a taste of these different areas where we think about the values of nature for ourselves, our work productivity, or our kids, our grandkids. It's a big deal. And it shows up in working memory, it shows up in mood, and it shows up in reducing anxiety and rumination. And you know, there have been this less well developed than a lot of other areas, but really lighting on fire this field now. And hundreds of studies, at least over the past decade. But now we're going to move to this question, you know, how do you integrate this kind of understanding into policy and finance and actually open up a better path for the future where we're investing in nature like our lives really depend on it. So that brings us in this history to 2016, where we're actually seeing not only lots of projects sort of taking off in different places, and I'd say thousands across the world, but real mainstreaming of some of them. And I'm going to show you two examples of the mainstreaming. So directly, the Natural Capital Project, our team with our many partners have worked in about 60 countries on a lot of different efforts to integrate into development planning or into urban planning, all this type of understanding. And then across those arenas, you know, there's coastal resilience is massively important, fresh water for drinking, irrigation and hydropower, really important, and setting standards more and more among investors and in the private sector generally. So I'm going to take you to two places, Latin America and then China, and then we'll wrap up, and I'd love to chat with you here and afterward out there. So let's go to Latin America first. So you all know, you know, I know with the Edwards Aquifer here and with just the flooding and this need to boil water to be safe going on now around Austin and beyond, that this is in everybody's minds. And it is certainly across Latin America. Cities are booming in size, so the need for water is going up really dramatically and vastly outpacing, you know, physical gray infrastructure in place to deliver it safely. And what's been replicated is that New York case, just to state it briefly, you know, and in the case of New York, people were just investing wherever they could along stream sides and stuff to improve water security for the New Yorkers drinking it. But across Latin America, it's come along a little later, and they're using much more of the science, developing a lot of it there and then applying it widely. So there are all these different downstream users, you know, the city residents, agricultural cooperatives and stuff, hydropower, and they're starting to pay upstream people. And how do you decide who to pay, how much to pay, and where to pay, and all that? It might sound like it might be easy, but if you think across Latin America, there are just vast watersheds, you know, that in some ways are as big as Texas. They'll have sub-watersheds and stuff, but vast regions serving cities far, far away. And where you make the investments is everything. And we need to be able to say not only where, but, you know, what do you do? Do you restore forest, like in the upper left photo, or in the middle one, I mean, or do you protect existing forest, or do you just fence the cows away from the water, which sounds like it's not rocket science, but that's what's really needed. And so what we've done is with this software I described, here's an example for Colombia. I don't know how many have been in Colombia, the famous Cauca Valley, with many cities along that yellow highway here. And they're all getting their water from these upper green, mountainous areas. And we're just going to look at this one city up here, Tuluá, and turn that watershed, the purple blobs are the watersheds, so any drop of rain that falls in them flows down to the city. And there it is on its side, so the top is at the top of the screen. And you can see the optimal sort of investment portfolio for a given budget level of, where you would protect land up here at the very top, the really steep slopes and right on the streams that, are this network here. You'd reforest where it's blue in these key places where they have these livestock concentrated kind of areas. You'd add a lot of trees, that's what silvopasture means, and so on. And running Invest, you can actually predict at different budget levels by how much you'd be able to improve water quality. So here's the water quality improvement by a certain percent, like reducing the sediment, which is really key right now in Austin. You could predict by how much you would be able to reduce it, maybe not in a flood event, which would need a separate kind of modeling, but anyway, in general, for a given budget level. And this has now been applied all across Latin America. The 40 kind of biggest cities have adopted this approach, and it's all voluntary still and kind of fragile, but it gives a sense of how much momentum is building. We're testing it in Nairobi now and have built up the whole approach there, and it's well underway. And in China, where I'm going to turn next, it's kind of going viral with many, many cities opting for this approach as opposed to letting people suffer with really poor health or, in the few cases where it might be possible, investing in the really expensive physical filtration plants. So that's one bright scaling pathway, and it's happening in the US more. And I want to learn a lot more about what's happening here. I know there are efforts right along these lines that have been in play for 20 years. And I look forward to seeing firsthand. But now I'm going to switch to China, and then we'll open up. So, yeah, we hear about China as a place that's maybe taken environmental devastation to the greatest extreme in human experience, and certainly as a nation, it basically is true. The flooding in that bottom left image is really widespread almost every year. I've been there for some of it, and it's unbelievable to see it happening on the big scales that are possible with the huge rivers of Asia. The air pollution and the poisoning of water is also really, really widespread, and people in North China have a lower life expectancy by 5 years or more, attributed to mainly poisoning of air and water. And then even the most culturally, deeply significant species like the giant panda hiding in the snowy image here on the right, are on the brink of extinction. And so it's all the more amazing with that backdrop, with having pursued growth kind of at all costs and having done aspects of it incredibly successfully and more successfully than any other modern culture, lifting more people out of poverty than any other place. But China's really changing now. And looking to the 21st century, this is President Xi Jinping saying we're reaching for an ecological civilization where clear waters and lush mountains are gold and silver, and we won't trade them for gold or silver. So they're aiming to completely redo capitalism and bring natural capital right into the heart of the equation in an inclusive green growth model. And I put this under the banner of national development and security because it's very much about that. And the inclusive growth part is massive. And so we're being asked, the Natural Capital Project, working together with colleagues there who started as humble panda scientists and are now trying to write this policy for China. where and how much to protect across the country? That's always a fundamental question that every place and state in the US should be asking. And how can we secure nature and livelihoods? And how can we move beyond GDP as our measure of progress and performance? So just telling you briefly, there's so much going on there, but I'll show you briefly in a few pictures that they've developed sort of real-time tracking. That's what we're advancing now, real-time tracking of natural capital, so that all across the country you can measure, how much food output is there of hundreds of different crop types. This just shows it in calories, because I'm not going to show you hundreds of slides, but for tons of different veggies, you can map out exactly where they're grown. And this is where the carbon sequestration is taking place. This is where sandstorm prevention is really important. All those cities are enveloped not only in industrial pollution, but a lot of it is from overgrazing of these arid areas to the north. This is where water supply most crucially needs to be protected. And then this is where biodiversity most crucially needs to be protected. And I show in green the existing reserves that are mostly these huge expanses in Tibet and regions where there's very low population density. And there are almost no preserves in the really densely populated parts of China. They're changing that now. No, green ones, existing ones. They're putting out a whole new nature reserve system where some reserves, those in the blue, are meant to focus on really sensitive biodiversity. And those in the orange are in places where the biodiversity's more happy to live and hang out with people, like in the way I was showing in the Costa Rican farming and pasture lands. And those will have different financial mechanisms. So they've visited the US for several 2-week trips understanding our park system and elsewhere, and they're just going all out now. It's exhilarating to see. They've zoned the land using Invest for natural capital, and these are the places that are prioritized for paying people to restore, this engine of economic and other aspects of well-being. So in any place, in any county or any scale, people are now mapping out in these 5-year master plans what each little unit of land is for, whether it's like for food production or water purification or flood control or climate stability or what have you. And there's typically 50 other things of concern at the local level. And presently about 200 million people are being paid to restore ecosystems, to restore nature in these places that are zoned. And part of our work is to understand, many of the people are older and their kids have left for factories as the best way to make a livelihood, and then the grandkids are still back out in the countryside. So it's finding out how to help people in a meaningful way on the livelihood side. The dual goals of poverty alleviation and inclusive growth are really important, as well as making sure they can cook their breakfast without, deforesting the area and that sort of thing. We're developing Invest for, determining I'll show you in a second, this system of green finance. Let me go on. And it relates to cities, because a lot of the wealth is in cities. So looking at this as our urban century, and how are we going to sustain nature in this century, we're setting up, we're developing Invest for urban systems. And actually, thanks to the head of TNC in Texas, Laura Huffman, we're going to start working in Austin next. But here's the last thing I'll get into, relating to this green financial system and tracking progress. And it's just looking back at all that's gone wrong and focusing so much on GDP types of growth, and thinking about alternative measures. There are a billion measures out there, but this one is really taking hold now in China. It's called Gross Ecosystem Product, and it could be applied anywhere. And the UN and other international organizations are also studying it now. So what we've developed is this measure that where on the left you see GDP, and that's all the standard stuff, all the goods and services produced by an economy in manufacturing sector, in construction, transportation, communications, everything else. And then over on the right, we've got all the goods and services coming from nature, and we're just beginning to get a handle on them, but it's equally complex. But we can do it, and there's a little overlap in the middle, right, of agriculture, forestry, a lot of types of tourism. And this is how it works. To measure GEP, we have these massive data streams coming in through satellites, drones, other sensing systems, incredible capability with AI and other analytical approaches to understand, what the story the data are telling in terms of trends and connections to people and our well-being. A lot of ground surveys, like in China, they've got 140,000 spots where someone goes out and checks what's happening on the ground each year and reports into a central system in terms of whether the cashmere producing goats are overgrazing and all that kind of stuff. And the idea is to track, the status of natural capital and then the flow of services from it. And then use that information to highlight, all the contributions of nature to the economy and society, and then develop financial compensation that many times is from cities to, the rural and more western parts of China. So all these urban residents, we're all dependent, even if we feel disconnected from nature, we're every bit as dependent as every other human being, and compensate to maintain the supply of benefits. And then finally, actually review performance of leaders and promote or demote leaders, and advance or scrap policies based on how well they're performing with this GEP. So it's amazing to see all that's happening there. There's a heck of a long way to go and many, many big worries at the same time. It's sort of two hands in China, and it's hard to know whether this movement is going to succeed, but it's something that could be applied all across China's sphere of influence, where there's also a lot of worry beyond the borders across the world. And this is a training we ran with people from 12 so-called Belt and Road Initiative countries, spanning Africa, all across Eastern Europe and Central Asia and South Asia in INVEST. And there's just overwhelming demand for technical capacity in applying these approaches really broadly. And that'll take me back then, just to wrap up, to these points of light all over the planet. And I've just mentioned a couple really, but everywhere you go, you see these new things developing, and makes me very grateful, actually, even though it's a hard time to be alive in some ways, to have this as a life quest along with millions of other people, real heroes in driving the innovation and taking the risk to do something new and to think differently and convince others to follow. And I'll just close thanking everyone here again, especially Trinity University Press, and everyone giving me the wonderful San Antonio hospitality for your attention, and I'd love to talk now or anytime afterwards. So thank you very much.
I think we'll move to some questions and answers. Is that right? And if anyone would like to ask a question, please come down to one of these microphones, and I'll kind of get it started. You've obviously spoken to ideas of valuation and, in some cases, compensation or investment. And I'm curious what you've observed, or what your feelings are, or what studies, what work's being done regarding accomplishing a lot of this through tax policy, whether it gets into exchanges and credits, or how prudent that is as a financial mechanism, especially many countries, but countries like the U.S. that attempts to accomplish or not accomplish so much through tax policy. And so just curious your thoughts about that.
You raised a really big question now, like, should we have a carbon tax? And let me say one quick thing first. I highly recommend a book by a wonderful colleague at Columbia at the Business School, an economist named Jeff Heel. His book is called Endangered Economies, and he lays this out really clearly and in very plain, simple, quick, nice to read. He's a Brit and he writes really well. And yeah, it's basically, economists all see a tax as by far the most efficient way to go to get the highest return on investment, where you can, obviously define how it's applied and make sure that you're not taxing unfairly and that the net impacts, improve everybody's well-being, that you're not overly taxing the poor, for example. All of that can be designed and is kind of in process in different places. But the US has, in contrast to other places, a strong ideology over some economic approaches. And overall, there's just so much resistance to the idea of a tax. Still, I know many Republicans in favor of a carbon tax and who are optimistic that one could go through with getting just a few more people on that side in the pretty near term. And so I'd say in the circles where I hear this conversation, that is certainly held up as the greatest hope for getting our greenhouse gas emissions down to where they need to be as rapidly as needs to happen, and to drive the transition to a clean energy system. And in Europe and China and other places, there's a lot of ideology over other things, but not over taxes so much, and the taxes are applied a lot more widely and to the effect that is expected. But there's still a long way to go, and if the U.S. doesn't buy in, it's obviously not just in the case of climate security, but that's a huge arena where the tax is discussed, most urgently as something needed. So thanks for that question. Let's start here and go back and forth.
Hello. Thank you. This is more inspiring than I know how to talk about. My name's Adam. I'm an architect. And seeing what you're doing, part of the reason it gives me hope is because the stress of my job a lot of times is that so much of the work and the design is driven by an economic spreadsheet, right? Is anybody in the development world in here? Hands? A few? Okay. There's things so often that somebody, a developer or an investor, is willing to consider on a personal level, but you end up with the comment at the end, but like, look, it just doesn't fit in the pro forma, right? So I guess one question is, in this organization, Natural Capital Project, it sounds like you are collaborating with the real estate world, the development world, the investment world. Am I correct about that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Are you collaborating with the design world?
Not yet.
Please do.
So let's elaborate a little.
Okay. We're the intermediary.
Do you mean architectural design and
architectural
cities,
landscape, environmental
Yeah.
design. So a loaded question to that point. The nature that this study had people walking around in, what type of nature was it? Where was it?
That was on the Stanford University campus, so in Silicon Valley, near Palo Alto and those places, and it involved a lot of native trees like oaks, similar to the ones around here, and bays, and a little bit of grass.
Okay, so what I would venture to guess that it is somewhat designed and curated nature.
You're getting at I think maybe you're getting at the question, what are the active ingredients and what should we maybe really design in, given that urban systems especially are, or am I going off?
No, you're there. The point that I'm making is that, one, just generally, I think you have a whole world of advocates in the design world. We are all, for the most part, hypersensitive to these things, and your generation's been making little steps in trying to systematize them. U.S. Green Building Council's, an example, trying to reduce the energy, reduce the energy loads in buildings. And from the landscape side, things like low impact environment, low impact design, even now incorporating some elements of permaculture to control water runoff and things like that. I know that we can help you, and that we want to. We just don't know how. We need this, because when you get into that meeting and you're trying to be an advocate for something, and that conversation stops dead in its tracks because it doesn't fit into a spreadsheet. Like, it sounds like you've got the spreadsheet.
Okay, I'm so glad to hear from you, and I'll.
Yeah. Can we be friends?
Let's be friends.
Okay, I'm not gonna take up any more mic time. I think that was.
Yeah, I would love to follow
everything.
up after, and if there's any group that wants to meet and chat about this, if you're able to hang out, then let's do that.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the last thought is
Great.
A big conversation everywhere right now is affordable housing. And affordable housing and gentrification, you've got cities growing, people are moving more into cities. So a tax is one thing, but if you can identify these areas and what maybe urban properties would need to do, you could possibly work with the city to provide tax incentives so that anyone who implements certain somethings on their property can get their taxes reduced so that people that have been living somewhere for a really long time aren't displaced by rising taxes. And so that could maybe.
That's the number one issue that comes up, is the worry that as you green places, you're just going to further marginalize already vulnerable communities, and above all, you don't want to do that. So I'm glad you pointed to that, and I'd love to talk further.
Yeah, I think you've got the numbers. Anyway, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's go to
Hi,
you
thanks.
now.
Yeah, I'm director of a regional group that's in 21 counties in Central Texas. It's Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance, and we're united to protect the Edwards Aquifer watersheds.
I've heard about you.
Thank you. 3 of our counties are in the top 5 fastest growing in the nation. So we are like really under the gun. And I'm so grateful to you and to Trinity for bringing you here tonight. It's really not too late for me to put together a package of proposals to take to the state legislature in January 2019. And I'm wondering if you would advise me, because I looked at, like, does this software cost money? That kind of thing.
Our value is to make everything free and open.
Really? So I can take
struggle.
something to the state and
We're
say,
always-
okay, this
yeah.
is free, we can do this, and see where we need to go from here?
Absolutely.
Yay.
You need some sharp wizards who can work at the software, but that's definitely been our objective, is to make this as accessible as possible. So
That is so wonderful, so thank you so much.
great to hear about your work.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay, not to drill you on economics again, and I'm no economist, and hopefully I won't sound like a naive, extreme college student, but capitalism is a system based on the premise of exponential growth. Businesses need to expand, profits need to rise, wages need to go up, stocks need to go up, that sort of thing, just this infinite growth. How do we deal with that in a finite world? Like, it seems like the two are completely incompatible. I don't have a problem with completely overdoing capitalism, but I know most people do. So how do we confront that?
Okay, well, you're putting your finger on, you shouldn't be denigrating yourself. That is the most important question, we could possibly be thinking about. We all know this can't go on forever. And are we just going to keep passing it down to the next generation, or can we be the ones to transform? And what I'd say is, nobody knows the answer, so you and everybody else is really needed to help. I guess the guy behind you might have the answer. But the idea that we're pursuing, there are a lot of things to pursue, but is just one by one to learn from these incredibly innovative, heroic experiments underway all around the world in very different cultural and economic and biophysical contexts, different governance contexts, and so on. How can we reform and keep, as economists putting it, sort of internalizing those costs that we're used to just imposing on everybody around us and the future. So how do we shine a light on those dependencies, the impacts and dependencies of people and nature, and make sure we develop more of a kind of circular approach with feedbacks? That will lead inch by inch, we hope, toward the transformation, but it's not going to happen in a overnight kind of way. So I see those water funds across Latin America, for example, as so inspiring, partly because we could see that as just a first step in thinking about how a city impacts and depends on surrounding areas for, certainly the biophysical and also some of the emotional and spiritual and other aspects of well-being of its residents as a first step toward waking people up. And I thank you for raising that question, and I hope we have some good things to report. We have got a lot to report that's good, over the past 10 and 20 years, and I hope we accelerate the pace. Thank you. Yeah.
I want to say thank you for coming to San Antonio. We are known to be a pretty green city and push in that direction. I noticed tonight that all of your studies have been on the earth in terms of land and trees and earth life. What about the oceans? I believe that most of the oxygen does come from the oceans, and yet we're destroying them.
I appreciate your saying that, and half my team works in the oceans, and they get quite mad at me when I stick to the land, and I shouldn't have done that. It's hard I could go on for days, but I'll give you a quick answer. First, or response, you're completely right, obviously, and there's actually tremendous progress in the marine realm, especially in coastal areas where in many ways our impacts are greatest, although we're depleting fisheries even in the farthest, most remote parts of the oceans. I'll give you one example that's also scaling up, and it also is from Latin America. So, tragically, with all these hurricanes hitting, our models for how nature, coral reefs or seagrass beds or other mangroves and other natural features along coastlines, how they protect communities and secure us from what inevitably are going to become more frequent and more severe storms. All of that work has now been tested year after year with these terrible storms. And our models are so good. Actually, when the BP oil spill occurred, our postdoc, a guy from Korea, was called in to go work with NOAA and predict how it would spread and all that kind of stuff. So the models hold up really well, and now we've demonstrated, how to develop an integrated national development plan along coastlines and more broadly across nations in about 5 different Latin American countries, starting in Belize, in smaller places, Barbados, the Bahamas, and now the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, is developing something they call Natural Capital Lab within the bank that's going to determine what kinds of loans are made, looking at sort of 20-year development trajectories of countries and what they'll actually support. And they're demanding that this coastal climate resilience and other aspects of natural capital that we've now tested out with them in these countries, that they be used across the entire Latin American region. So that's one example.
I was wondering, do any of your models include desalinization plants? Because they're fixing to put one in down at the coast in the Aransas Pass, Port Aransas area, and the residents are very up in arms, stating that this is going to destroy the ecology there and disrupt everything. So do any of your models include desalinization studies?
I'd say there are other experts who are better on that, but in the approach we've developed, you can easily integrate that, asking, okay, if you need to increase water or by a certain quantity per year, you can either become more efficient in use, you can improve supply from alternative sources, including potentially building one of these plants. And we could easily do the analysis, sort of comparing what it would take financially and in mobilization and stuff to achieve that improvement in water security by becoming more efficient, upgrading systems. That's what they did in New York in part, or by improving the green infrastructure, the nature supplying water, or then looking at the trade-offs of a plant. And it's not only impacts in the ocean, it's also really huge energy costs. So if you take the point of this approach is to take a really integrated, system-wide, sector-wide view. So you get the whole picture and aren't kind of solving different problems in ways that actually make things worse in other ways. So the answer is basically yes, though we don't have a specific desal model right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hey,
Well, I'd be delighted if I
Suspense.
could give an essay, one or another, because there's several, to everybody here, if it's possible. You put your finger on the solution. You mentioned we need to take account of the externalities, right? Can I just mention another word for the natural capital would be natural wealth, is that right?
Sure.
Okay, the air and water belongs to everybody. When the industries put pollution, if somebody messes up what belongs to you, they should pay you compensation. And if they were paying a fee high enough that you take a random survey, well, they're going to try not to foul the environment if they had to pay to put pollution. So let's take a random survey and we ask, are they trying hard enough not to put mercury or carbon or whatever into the air?
So who thinks they're trying hard enough?
I don't.
Nobody.
Okay, and then, so the next question is, well, what would be an appropriate rate of reduction? And although there might be 90% people say we should reduce, there might be only 50% of the people who say we should reduce at least 7% per year. So you go to the amount of difficulty, the challenge, the target should match what average opinion says we ought to aim for. So you have some people saying, well, it shouldn't be so strict, and some people saying, well, it's more strict. But on average, the world we live in then would match what the people want. That would be a real democracy.
I guess we could debate that point.
Well, yeah,
when you worry about all the misinformation out there, and whether people have the capacity to understand the trade-offs. I feel so much of this has been badly skewed by claims that it would cost too much to protect the environment when it's the only thing we can afford to do.
See, I think that's one of the beauties of taking a random poll, because the policy would never be more extreme, more difficult than what most people are willing to accept, right? And if there's misinformation about, well, carbon's not bad, oh, hey, northern Canada could be a little warmer, So there's going to be different opinion, but if we at least aim for what most people think is acceptable, we'll be a whole lot better off. We'll have something more deserving the label of democracy.
I'm
And
completely
all the-
with you on the dialogue we need to have.
All the money
Much
collected.
more.
You know Robert Costanza? Yeah. So what was his estimate for if every person was paid? He didn't present it in this way per person, but about how much money would that be if we reflected the value of natural wealth and each person got a slice of it? What would the income be? Do you know approximately?
Yeah, sorry.
I think we're going to watch time and
Okay.
take one more question
Let's
and then
talk
can
more
continue the
upstairs.
discussion.
Robert Costanza in Nature, he published 2014, $125 trillion a year. That's $100 a day for everybody. So share those pollution fees, environmental impact fees to all people. Environmental problems and economic challenges are resolved.
If we did what you're proposing, we would be well down the right path.
That's why I raised my
Yeah.
hand when you said,
Thank
well,
you.
Where's the,
Great. Thank you.
thank you.
Hey, last one
Hi.
from New Mexico.
I was wondering for the nature experience that reduces the negative thoughts. Where did you get the people for the experiment? Were they random people that you just picked off the street, or was there specific characteristics?
Yeah, there's a big program in the psychology department at the university where I'm based that recruits people on kind of a random basis. And so they all came from around the nearby cities. It's a little bit like San Antonio with a lot of kind of interconnected municipalities. And so they were all within a few miles of the campus, and they came on a voluntary basis. And I think they got paid a whopping $25 to spend the time taking the tests and then doing the little walk.
Thank you.
And they were all from the city. Good question. And it's actually, are you a college student now?
I am not.
I used to sign up for these. They were really fun. Maybe you can say that's why my brain.
I'm a middle schooler.
You're in
I'm
middle
in 8th
school?
grade.
Wow, okay. Well, thanks for that brave question. And yeah, if you have the chance to do research in this area, it's really a really, really interesting area. And as a student, I used to sign up a lot and just try out different studies that way. And you might be able to sign up here also. Well, let me thank everybody again and say I really appreciate your patience and smile and good spirit, and we'll meet upstairs for those who can stay.
Please join us in the West Lobby to sign books and continue the discussion. Thank you.